the percussionist has always been a storyteller in a way. Percussionist has always been in some integral part of the overall musical narrative. I mean, if you go back to the beginning of recorded Western classical music, you find the percussionist is doing a couple of very basic things. First of all, it's important to note that percussion instruments were originally outdoor instruments. They were designed to be played on horseback. They were designed to be heard over vast distances outdoors. So when they were first brought into a concert hall, their function was largely to disrupt, to garner attention, to be outsiders in this otherwise euphonious sound world. So when you look at a Beethoven score and you suddenly see a loud timpani note, for example, in the Sixth Symphony that signifies that the storm has finally arrived, what you get is a sound that doesn't really belong to the orchestra. It seems like an outsider. And that's the way percussion operated in the orchestra for many, many years. The cymbals, for example, and the triangle, sounds which you can find in the last movement of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, were exotic outside elements in that environment. And they were brought into the Western musical canon from the near Middle East. In other words, every one of Beethoven's listeners realized that these were sounds of Turkish music, of the Janissary style. And so when they appeared in this really lovely little variation at the end of the Beethoven Ninth, or the middle of the last movement of the Beethoven Ninth Symphony, they stood for something, they stood for a kind of story. This was music from far away, from a distant place that didn't really belong. But then, as the 19th century progressed, percussion went along two tracks. On one hand, it was apart from the orchestra. It continued to be the sounds, the noises, the incursions from the outside world. But the orchestra also acculturated those instruments and brought them into the vocabulary. So by the time you hear a cymbal crash at the end of the 19th century in a Mahler symphony, it sounds like it belongs to the orchestra in a way that it did not 100 years earlier. Percussion has retained, throughout the course of the 19th century, its role as outsider in many ways. It often stands for an event which signifies something more powerful or more vivid or even more grotesque than the other instruments of the orchestra are capable of realizing. So when you come to the third movement of Wozzeck, the Alban Berg opera, at a moment when Marie has been killed and the knife that killed her flung into the lake, what Berg does to represent the horror of that moment is to have a single tam-tam crescendo, a large gong, like the one that I'm sitting in front of, that goes from inaudibility to as loud as possible. This is Berg's only way of saying something so enormous, something so horrific, something so passionate has happened that it has to be given to the noise of the percussionist. Now, for the better part of the history of Western classical music, those sounds have been accompanimental, maybe even secondary. A cymbal crash didn't exist on its own in the time of Beethoven or the time of Berlioz. It was there to highlight an important moment in the piece. It was there to show that an important chord change had been reached or that a formal point of arrival had been arrived at. And so the percussion was always twinned with something else that was going on. But when tonal harmony dissolved in the early 20th century, composers had by that point a large collection of percussion sounds, and suddenly their job description had been obviated. There weren't chord changes to reinforce. Formal architecture had gone the way of the chord change, and so when Varese, to some extent even Stravinsky, started to work with percussion instruments, it was as freely moving radicals in a brand new musical atmosphere. So those instruments and those sounds could be used for their own value and for their own worth, and they were not completely then reliant upon having an orchestra to give them sense. This was the world that Varese discovered, and the world that Cage discovered, and the world that Lou Harrison discovered, and it was the world that we've all grown up in. Percussion music being unhinged from its orchestral and tonal environment and capable of being used for its own worth and value.